Now that the base cabinets are finished and I have them installed, I can start working on the drawers. And to do the bulk of that, I'll be using this 1/2-inch plywood right here. Now it's very important before you get started on this to measure the thickness of the plywood that you're using. The plans, of course, are made for the absolute value of a 1/2 inch for the material thickness. And of course, if you're using solid wood, to build these instead of plywood, you can always plane it down to exactly a 1/2 inch and therefore eliminate any error. But plywood, it depends. I mean, it can vary from 7/16, which is a full 16th less than a 1/2 inch, to a little bit more than a 1/2 inch. And that's basically what I have here. When I measure it with my calipers, now I'm not recommending being that anal about it, but it can help because these have to fit properly. And mainly, like, the fit has to be so that they're not too tight. Too tight is bad. They can be a little bit loose, like I already talked about before, especially if you install the drawer slides using those cutout tabs. That gives you a little bit of flexibility to pull the drawer slides out away from the sidewalls a little bit, or enough to make up for that smaller size drawer. I'm actually going to shoot for maybe a 30 seconds of an inch less than the dimensions that I have here. Just cut it slightly undersized. This is not something that you have to do, like you have to set up precisely. Just, nudge your table saw fence over just a small amount when you're cutting the parts that make it up from side to side, say, which would be the front and the back and the bottom. All of those, reduce that just by the thickness of the mark that's on the tape on your table saw. To get started, I'm cutting the sheet in half so that it's easier to handle on a table saw. And then I'm going to set my fence to 16 inches and cut these individual strips down to width, and then reset my saw to 3 inches for the individual parts. In this case, it'll be the sides of the shallow drawers, and make those cuts until I have the 20 that I need, and then switch to 4.5 to get the 4 that I need, and then to 5.5 to use up the rest. While I'm cutting these parts, you'll notice that I'm flipping the board each time. And what that does is it eliminates any error that accumulates when you're making this kind of repetitive cut. That takes care of everything, almost. I've got 2 more parts to cut. That's 16 inches wide. Everything else is 20 3/4, but it's the 20 3/4 that's slightly reduced to make the drawers just a small amount narrower than the opening. So I'm going to adjust my saw that way, and I'm going to take the sheet and start cutting strips off the end of it. At this point, the sheet is small enough that I can handle it comfortably. And it's worth pointing out that before I started cutting the individual pieces out of those first 2 strips, I actually took the square and made sure that the corner is square. And I've done the same with the opposite end of the sheet that I'm cutting now. All right, so I just finished cutting the rest of that sheet, those 3 strips, into bottom panels, and that gives me 9. I got 3 per strip. I still need 5 more for a total of 14. 14 drawers, 14 drawer bottoms. Like I said, this uses a lot of material. So I got to take another sheet. This time I'm just going to draw out and make a rough cut, handheld with the circular saw. I'm not going to bother with the straight edge guide because I'll be working from the square end of each piece. And once again, I've checked to make sure that these are actually square with my framing square. These parts are the front and back panels for the shallow drawers. What I just did was I changed out the blade to a flat top, 1/8 inch curved blade. This is the one I normally use for box joints. And I want that in there to create the joinery for these drawers. And it's very simple. Basically what you're going to be doing, or what I'm going to be doing, is cutting a curve that a tongue, and that's cut in the other piece, fits into. And the size of that is 1/8 of an inch. So it just goes together with a single cut. And then I'm going to take all of the parts that need to be cut that way and run them through the saw. And that starts with all of the bottom panels. I'm making the cut on the ends. Every single bottom panel will get a cut like this, and then the front and back panel as well. And I'm using my mini table saw sled for these ones along with the fence. Now normally you don't want to do that, use the sled with the fence, but there's no real risk of kickback here because the blade is not sticking up high enough. I just double check to make sure that I have everything cut. The last ones that I did cut were the 4.5 inch ones for the medium depth drawer and the 5.5 inch ones, which are right here. There are only 4 of each one of those, but there were quite a number of these, 20. So that's that cut taken care of. That's the tongue. Now I need to make the groove, and the groove gets cut into the side panels. One across the bottom for the bottom panel, and one on each end for the front and back panels to slot into. So this, this, and this. The first thing I need to do is cut a sample to make sure that everything lines up correctly. I'll be able to set the fence in one location and make all of these cuts all at the same time. Very much like the cut that I just did. And that's the beauty of this system. There's not a whole lot of changing stuff around. All you need to do is set it up accurately twice and run all the parts. Okay, I cut the first one, and it makes sense to do a dry fit before you commit to doing the rest to see how it's working. It's fitting together quite nicely, so what I'm going to do is finish cutting the rest of the parts, and then I can start assembly.